like to, oh sorry, so this is what the panel is. So it's open data, engaging research, empowering communities with the people's names who I've just mentioned before. So hopefully this is the session you intended to come to and you're not getting a rude shock that you're coming to something that you didn't sign up for. Either way, feel free to stay. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the city campus stands, and also where I am very privileged to live and work. Northern City campus on Gadigal land, just to clarify that. So I'd like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land, which I think is such an important thing for us to do when we're talking about not just knowledge and research as we tend to do at universities, but this idea of making the knowledge open and sharing, because the more we learn about the traditional custodians, we sort of discover not just how intricate their knowledge systems were, but how intricate the systems were for sharing and communicating that knowledge was, which is very inspiring and illuminating to look into. So, nope, I've skipped ahead of myself. So the way the session is basically going to be running is that we're going to have a little bit of an introduction to each of the panel. They're going to be talking about their work, their sort of relationship with open data, I suppose is a way to phrase it. And then we'll be going into sort of some questions from me, and then we'll be opening up the floor to questions from you. Feel free to sort of add your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll get to those as we can. But what I might just do is quickly read out, I'll stop sharing my screen so that hopefully you'll be able to see our fabulous panel being featured up over there. And I'll just quickly read out some very brief bios of them so you know who they are. So Professor Deborah Marsh is the discipline leader of medical science in the School of Life Sciences in the science faculty. She's a cell and molecular biologist running the translational oncology group at UTS. She also holds an honorary appointment as a professor of molecular oncology at the University of Sydney. She has over 130 publications, cited over 11,000 times, and an H-index of 49. And she served as a number of, she serves on a number of journal editorial boards, and is currently the topic editor for Human Molecular Genetics, an associate editor for endocrine-related cancer, and a section editor for cancers. So welcome, Debbie, and thank you for giving your time. Dr. Alana Piper is a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Australian Centre for Public History here at UTS. Her research interests draw together the social and cultural history of crime with criminological, legal, and digital humanities approaches. Her current project, Criminal Characters, uses digital history to chart the lives and criminal careers of Australian offenders across the 19th and 20th century. She has authored over 40 academic publications and is currently an investigator on the ARC Discovery Project, Sex and the Australian Military 1914 to 1920, and the ARC LEAF Project, Time-Layered Cultural Map of Australia. Michael Lynch is a developer and analyst in e-research who works on specialized IT support for academic research, research data management, open access data, and data publications. He specializes in research data management policy, governance, and platforms, helping researchers to access, store, and reuse and publish research data using modern open standards. So I think we'll start with you, Debbie, if that's all right.
Sure. So thank you, and thanks for that little introduction. So as was just said, I'm a cell and molecular biologist, and my group researches cancers that mainly affect women, with a big focus at the moment on ovarian cancer. So we work at both the basic science or discovery-based angles, as well as more translational research. So I've worked in medical research institutes, both here and in the US. I've worked on hospital sites and I've worked at universities. So I'm dating myself now, but I published my first paper back in 1991. It was a book chapter when I was working as a research assistant in the vet school at the University of Sydney, and it was on heat shock proteins and their role in embryonic development. So as was said, I have over 130 papers now, and the last one was published just last week. This was a nice collaboration with researchers at UNSW looking at better ways to deliver drugs to ovarian cancer cells using nanoparticles. So it was a little bit different for us, but a nice collaboration and resulted in a good paper. So between the first one and the most recent one, there have been papers investigating familial cancer syndromes, genetics and epigenetics of cancer, and experiments designed to investigate how we can better understand the molecular nature of cancer to improve the lives of people who get it. So in the lab, we're using gene editing, so a technique called CRISPR-Cas9, and you may have heard that before, even if you're not in the science field, because it is used in the media. And I think it's used in the media because gene editing is an interesting thing to a lot of people. And also the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020 was awarded to the discoverers of this technique, Jennifer Daudner and Emmanuel Charpentier. So you may have heard about CRISPR-Cas9. And we're also using 3D bioprinting, which is quite exciting for us, to create better models of ovarian cancer to help us study this malignancy and also to set up for drug screening. So as was said, my papers have been cited over 11,000 times, so I know that at least some of them have made strong impacts in my field. And as a scientist, I think that's absolutely what drives us. We want to discover and we want to make impact, and publishing is certainly one way to do that. So I've been an editor for 6 journals, starting for me way back in 2002, and currently I'm on the editorial boards of 3 journals. So the current ones have offices either in the UK, the US and Switzerland, and all have open access policies. And for the European ones, it's been really strongly driven by Plan S, that I understand is also a big driver for the open access policies coming out in Australia. So our lab also has deposited our data sets, or some of our data sets, into publicly available data repositories. So for example, the European Genome Phenome Archive. And there are many other data repositories such as GenBank, EMBL, Gene Expression Omnibus. And this is now often a prerequisite for even submitting a paper. So to even get to the review stage, you need to publish. If the work that you've done has a data set, you need to publish that data set in one of these gene repository data, well, these data repositories, not always genes, sometimes proteins and other types of repositories, but making it publicly available. So I think this makes the kind of science that we do more transparent, and it lets other researchers look at our data and maybe also look at our data in different ways. And I like to think it really is working hard towards improving research integrity in science. So we haven't yet put any of our papers into a preprint server. I understand there's now over 60 preprint servers, and I think we will do this. We just haven't got there yet. So there's certainly evidence that open access papers are cited more, but I think the big issue as a researcher with open access is who pays for it, and which of your papers do you think should really go straight to open access. So some journals have read and publish agreements with institutions, so it's the institution who pays for its members to publish. And in the ideal world, this would be a model that I think many researchers would like to see, because it can be really expensive. So for example, one of the journals I'm an editor of, Endocrine-Related Cancer, to go straight to open access costs £3,000 sterling, which is about 5,500 Australian dollars. And this is really, it's prohibitive for many researchers, dare say almost all researchers, to be thinking of that kind of money. So I'm sure who pays for open access is a topic that will get discussed today. I hope it does. And if UTS is asking, how can we help you? That's certainly, as a researcher, one of the areas I'd like to point to. And I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Great introduction to your research, but also the sort of the concept of a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about as a whole. So thank you very much for that. Alana, would you like to go next?
Yeah, great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I just have a couple slides to introduce myself with. Are you all seeing my screen? Yep, great. Okay, so as mentioned in the introduction, I'm a historian specialising in crime and criminal justice. When I started my training as a historian sort of 10 years ago, data wasn't really something that was discussed in history, let alone open data. We talk about sources, we talk about records, less talk about data as something that has changed in the last 10 years. And I consider myself part of a movement of what's called, records to data, where we're looking at converting records into more sort of, big data that's also ideally shared and open for other researchers. to look at and work with and verify with as well. So in terms of my current project, criminal characters, the sort of big research question that underpins it, and in fact underpins most of the work that I've done, across a whole number of different topics, is really how and why do people end up in the criminal justice system across time? What are the sorts of factors that lead to different people becoming criminalised? And in terms of the criminal characters project, it's really the first project that sort of looks at that question from a data perspective, and the first assemblage of large-scale relational data of offender life histories covering a period from the 1850s through to the 1940s. So what are we talking about? We're talking about records to data. Well, these are the sort of records that form the base level of my research around life histories, and they're prison records from Victoria. There's 40,000 of these different sort of individual records that have been converted into data now. And this gives us relational quantitative data that people simply didn't have before when they were thinking about these questions of who was going through the criminal justice system over time, and thinking about things like how does literacy and education impact on chances of offending and recidivism, and is there a connection between that sort of level of education and other factors within the sorts of variables of offenders' backgrounds, some of which on here that you might not think are particularly relevant, like height, actually end up becoming incredibly relevant. And so, for instance, with height, you can see by comparing prisoner records with other types of records like soldier records that the people who end up in prison are much more likely to be shorter. That's linked to sort of nutrition, poverty factors. That there's a whole lot of data that once you convert these records into data, that you can start to assess the sort of different variables in people's backgrounds that have been important in terms of that journey into the criminal justice system. So in terms of converting these records to data, that's been the main object of the Criminal Characters project, which the URL's there, and the work of transcribing and getting those 40,000 records into reusable data has been done through crowdsourcing, through putting these records out to the public and inviting them to volunteer on the project to transcribe the different components of these records. With that, the data is now been going through the process of cleaning. If you're familiar with the UTS data arena, there's now a collection of this data in there that people can go in and play around and really look at these questions of what are the sorts of relationships between these different variables. How does where someone's born, or what their family history might be, relate to other factors that impact upon their likelihood of repeat offending, say, or the types of offending that they're engaging in. And in addition, the focus of today being open data, something that I'm really passionate about is sharing this data, particularly because my work has been done through crowdsourcing, through public involvement in producing this data. I believe that that data needs to be handed back to the public and made publicly available. And I think the best options for doing that is to have multiple options or multiple ways. That's the safest way of storing data, is to store it in multiple locations. So with historical data and this type of data, one pathway is to hand it back to the archives where the original records come from, and that's part of the agreement with getting these archive records and using them in this way, is then depositing the data back with those archives. Something that some researchers might be familiar with is the Australian Data Archive, referred to as the Dataverse, where researchers can deposit different data collections that they've worked on, different research data. And the Dataverse now has a specific data repository just for historical criminal justice records. So some of my data is published on there. And also something I'm sure Michael will be talking about later is UTS has come up with data solutions of how researchers can store data. So I've been working with Michael on getting some of my data into a research object crate, which you can see a sample of there. So looking forward to continuing to talk about all these open data options and the benefits thereof.
Thank you so much, Alana. That's a fantastic intro. And yeah, I think it's that whole, I've spoken with a lot of people, both historians and other sort of humanities people, about that shift from records to data as sort of initially like quite a problematic thing for them, but it's great that it's obviously becoming a much more sort of positive and active based thing. Michael.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Andreas. I'm Mike Lynch. I work for the eResearch group in Research IT. That's a part of the UTS IT division. We provide specialized support for researchers. The sorts of systems that I work on are around research data management, data description, and data publication. So I'll just share my screen and give a quick overview of the, if I'm doing this rightly, you should be able to see the UTS Research Data Portal. So at UTS, we have a system called Stash. Stash is a research data management planning tool, and it includes a data publication workflow, which allows researchers to create data records, then create a data publication description, which has the metadata for publishing the data, and then a workflow which goes through a simple review stage and then ends up on the UTS Research Data Portal. The context for this is an organisation called ARDC, the Australian Research Data Commons, which is formerly known as ANZ, have been providing support and infrastructure and collaboration for helping Australian research institutions create a national data commons. They provided the standards around which our research data management platform was originally based, and have also provided services like RDA, which is the Research Data Australia, which is an aggregator for these sort of data sets. I won't go into too much detail about things, the standards we're using for this. One of them that Alana has mentioned is RO-Crate. RO-Crate is a standard for providing a rather basic but human readable view of a data set, which you can see here. But it also provides a machine readable metadata object, which can be picked up by things like Google Scholar. So it provides things like description, citation, keywords, all this kind of metadata stuff in a format that the broader set of aggregators like Google Scholar can pick up and surface and make your data discoverable. In addition to, on the data portal, most of these data sets are sort of a landing page and then some files that can be downloaded. But I'll just show you some of the work that my colleague Simon Kruik has been doing with Associate Professor Shauna Murray, who's a UTS researcher, with some, this is, what we're looking at here is a prototype of data that's coming off live sensors out in the field in estuaries. This is stuff to do with oyster fisheries, so salinity, water temperature, and all that sort of thing. We're downloading this sensor data, storing it as open standards like CSV files. But what we're looking at here is a sort of web interface to this, so that eventually this is going to be a sort of public access portal where people can drill into this data and look at it with a faceted search by year, month, date, and actually go through to the data set itself where they can actually download it. So this is an example of, rather than the published data just being a static thing which is wrapped up and presented, it's not real time, but it's a live data archive that other researchers or members of the public, because this data is of interest to people who are running oyster farms and other people in agriculture and fisheries, can actually access this data. Not, as I said, real time, but as a growing longitudinal study that's available to them. So yeah, it's the sort of thing that we've been working on and will continue to work on.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. That last project, yeah, it is really interesting. I love the point you made about the fact that it's not publishing data. It's not just an end of project sort of activity. It's something that can be a lot more sort of integrated, a lot more active. And you know, obviously we've got another project on the panel that does that very, very well, which is of course the criminal characters one. And because obviously, Alana, you've got that citizen history sort of angle with it about sort of engaging members of the public to do a lot of the transcribing around it. And I'm just wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about what that involved, but then also, you know, like what sort of tasks the volunteers performed, how you found them, how you sort of managed the volunteers, and all of those sorts of things, the platforms that were used, which you've already sort of addressed in some ways. And then also, like, how did you find this process? Was there anything very surprising about either the process itself, the resulting data, the responses or benefits to the volunteers, and all of those sorts of things? Because I think I know I've asked you to talk about it a lot, and I know you've written a beautiful journal article that covers a lot of this sort of stuff, but it would be great to sort of hear some of those sort of stories about it.
Yeah, thanks, Andreas. So to start with the question of the platform, so you sort of saw in the slides the sort of transcription site, what that looks like. So that's built with Zooniverse, which is a open source, crowdsourced building tool platform. So you know, anyone can go in, that's free to use. It's built by University of Oxford in collaboration with the University of Chicago. And so they've got now, I think, around 100 crowdsourcing projects that are sitting on there that are active at the moment and publicly available. And with that too, the great thing about Zooniverse is that they have 2 million registered volunteers. So, you know, 2 million people who are sort of subscribed to their newsletter and get notifications when there's a new academic research project that's published on that platform that, you know, wants volunteers to complete research tasks. So that was a tremendous asset in terms of being able to recruit people to jump on and volunteer on the project. There's now just on you know, my project, almost 9,000 volunteers sort of signed up and working on that project. So all the Victoria's prison records, the 40,000 that I meant, they're completely transcribed now, but because we had such an active research community, I was keen to see if I could get them keep working on different projects and working on transcribing more data. And so now the New South Wales and Tasmania prison records for that 1850s to 1940s period are also being transcribed, which I did not think that we would get to within the project sort of year limits. So it will be great to have that comparative data and, you know, tremendous enthusiasm. One of the surprising things that came up was, you know, the impact of COVID in terms of that volunteer and public engagement. So, you know, I was impressed with the sort of level of public engagement, level of work that was able to be done with the volunteers before COVID happened. But when COVID happened, the number of volunteers just sort of shot through the roof. I think I had sort of, you know, 2,500 volunteers signed up pre-COVID, and, you know, within 6 weeks that number doubled after the starts of the first lockdowns last year, because obviously people had time at home and were looking for things to do and things to learn. So, you know, in terms of mentioning that issue of sort of public engagement and citizen engagement, I think it really is an interesting thing to do when we sort of think about public engagement. It's usually a sort of end of project outcome that happens here. It's sort of really going on during the project itself. And you know, that article that you mentioned, you know, one of the things that I was really interested in is this idea that it's almost a sort of form of public pedagogy, and, you know, what are volunteers getting out of these experiences? What are they learning? Which, you know, yeah, they've actually absolutely gone gangbusters on the Criminal Characters Project, and very active on the sort of talk board that we have, this community forums discussing the project, you know, in terms of management. Lots of questions directed at me. Initially, sort of, you know, help questions, how do we do this? What does this mean? That kind of thing. But more and more as the project's going on, you know, they're really interested in learning about the history and understanding about the system, which I think is a great sort of, you know, public engagement outcome to have. Yeah, does that sort of answer your question? I could go on a lot more.
I'm sure you could, and I have hundreds of questions about the project, having a history background myself. But you know, it's one of those things. You know, there are other people around, so we should.
Yeah.
But no, that's great. I love the fact that you emphasize the whole idea of the sort of, you know, that it's the volunteers aren't just sort of like bodies who are doing the sort of work, like they're getting something out of it. There is very much that idea of like that conversation with the data, with the research, which I think is pretty much the whole idea around sort of these open access policies, is that it is about that sort of relationship that we have there.
And one of the things that I will mention that's interesting about open data is that a lot of them sort of went beyond the remit of just doing the transcription, and within the community forum had gone out and found links to other data sets that were online and publicly available. So where, and you know, as someone appears in the prison record, they might have found that name of that person in newspaper reports, or in the National Archives military records where there were soldiers and that kind of thing, and they were making those links for me, which, you know, is really what I was expecting to do as the researcher, but you know, some of them just sort of jumped on it and started to do that research.
Oh, I mean, that's absolutely incredible, and such a heartening thing to hear about sort of that sort of engagement with history and engagement with research that you're getting from people. Deborah, I sort of wanted to ask you, because I think you're sort of in an interesting position, because you're a discipline head, you're a researcher yourself, but you're also the editor of a few sort of journals that you sort of mentioned, and there are all of these sort of open access policies. And I suppose I wanted to sort of get from you, like, the sort of the general perception or attitudes towards like open data, sharing data, publishing data in sort of like the school, your faculty, the sort of the discipline that you're a part of as a whole. But then also, as sort of the editor of a journal, like what role you see journals having in sort of trying to promote the sort of the practice around this idea of open data.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things to dissect out there. I think, you know, obviously as academics, it's part of our, it's in our KPIs, it's in our metrics to publish. So it's not a choice to publish, we have to publish. And a lot of us, as Alana sort of alluded to as well, we're working with public data, with public money as well. So, you know, we owe it to have our work out there and very openly accessible. So not only for academic progress and, you know, progress within our fields. Oh, sorry, that's my phone. Oh no, and my husband's up the back doing another Zoom. He's not going to answer it. Can I just stop that phone?
Of course, yes.
So, I'm so sorry.
No, totally fine.
Stop by itself.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's as somebody on editorial boards for journals, I actually contacted one of the people more in publishing that to prepare for this and to sort of get a little bit more from their perspective, and certainly it's very dissected from anything academic and any so like the nature of the work, the quality of the work, that's all totally assessed independently of whether or not things will be viewed in an open access way at all. So I think that's very important. I thought it would be a brief conversation. This woman was based in London. We spoke for like an hour and a half late one of my nights. There is so much that journals are doing to promote open access. I think a lot of it really did come from Plan S and that real push from, you know, places in Europe. but certainly there's, this read and publish. So we're trying to have these transformative agreements with institutions, with universities, to really get the universities to pay so their academics can publish more readily in open access, because there's certainly evidence that open access papers achieve more citations. So you're getting your work out there quicker, it's open, it's being read by more people, it's making an impact. And impact, I think, across all our faculties is a buzzword that people use at UTS. We have to make impact, and as academics we want to be making impact as well, and the quicker we can get our work out there, the better. I've noticed that there's also something called Research for Life that a lot of the journals are quite engaged with, where there's lists of countries that, basically some researchers in some countries, they just can't pay for article processing charges or publishing charges, let alone the open access. So there's certainly quite a long list of countries. No Australia in there, but I notice on the first list Afghanistan and Angola, but no A for Australia. So we're not on the list, but there are certainly major efforts to get publications coming from other countries as well. So I guess that's really tackling that sort of equitable and social side of getting, research out there and published and read. And it's so important, because good research can come from these countries as well. It's not only, the US or UK as the gold standard. There's good research happening all over the world, and it needs to get out there.
No, absolutely. And I love that sort of thing about sort of making it more open for not just, I think we tend to have this very sort of fixation on sort of developed countries. It's sort of what they're able to sort of do in terms of publishing the research, but realizing that no, there's a whole world of research out there, literally, that can be made more open, that can be sort of shared more widely, and there's a lot of things that can be done with it. It's just sort of often that will, and unfortunately, that sort of the money side of things is always a very, very tricky question there. So thank you very much for that, Deborah. Mike, something you and I have chatted about in the past is how very often, we get approached by researchers after they've basically been told by a journal or a journal saying that hey, listen, we've accepted your manuscript, all of these sorts of things, but where's your data? We want the DOI for it. We want to sort of link it with the article and stuff. And that's the point where they realize I don't know, I need to actually make the data itself open, not just the article. So what I'm just sort of wondering is what do you think can be done either by support staff, by journals, by libraries, whatever it is, to try and make this a lot clearer for researchers from the outset, or to help make these practices a bit more common, and therefore less of a surprise for researchers who sort of reach that stage where they're just about to be published?
Yeah, so I mean, there are disciplines, excuse me, where data publication is the norm and where this doesn't catch researchers by surprise. I think the cases that have come to us they're typically not people from the life sciences or genomics or disciplines where it's taken for granted that data will be made open. Often it's surprise. I don't know if this says anything. Often it's been from people in engineering, and they'll have gone through the long process of getting an article published. And for early career researchers, this is especially disheartening because they're sort of just making their way. And then at the last minute, they think they've got a publication and they go, oh, by the way, we want all of your data to be online somewhere with a DOI. And it does, it takes them by surprise. I know that there's quite a lot of effort is put into professional development for researchers and getting the message about open data into the sorts of training that the university provides for helping people start on the processes around publication, making people aware that data publication is an increasing requirement. Even things like providing, information about which journals require it, because that's often public knowledge, but it's not necessarily the sort of thing that the researcher is going to go and look up by themselves. So yeah, it's part of that professional development thing and the other side of it is making it relatively easy for people to do this, because there are things like Figshare, there are discipline-specific repositories which, if researchers are in the know about, they can use those. But we can't take it for granted that people know about these things. So institutions need to provide fairly painless pathways to get this stuff onto the web somehow, do the fiddly scholarly things again that they're not necessarily familiar with, like getting a DOI and that sort of thing, and making that sort of seamless for them. So.
No, absolutely. And I think the point you made about, and I know this is something we've also sort of discussed a few times, is like sort of having sort of a place where people can kind of go, and if they're submitting to a journal, knowing where to look and being able to more easily get the information about like, will you need to make the data available in this particular journal? And I know like it's resulted in us in the library having many searches around to see if we can find any of those sorts of lists, and some exist, but they're not always great. So yeah, thank you very, very much. Okay, I still have a lot of the prepared questions that I have, but I would like to open it up to the floor. So if anyone who's sort of in attendance here would like to ask any questions, please do put it into the chat, or if you don't mind being recorded, feel free to turn your camera on and turn your mic on, and then yeah, ask the questions like that as well. Whilst you're having a little bit of a think and sort of typing away, a question that I just sort of like to ask the panel as a whole, you know, what role do you feel that, and we've sort of touched on a few of these sorts of things as well, but I think I'd like to sort of get sort of a little thing from all of you, is like, what role do you feel systems and infrastructure and support have in this space? Like, do you think it could be made easier, to more integrated workflows, those sorts of things? And Mike, I mean, you've already sort of spoken about these things, especially from that sort of behind the scenes perspective. I mean, Alana, both sort of as a researcher who's worked with Mike around a lot of these things to sort of get sort of help with a lot of these platforms and infrastructures, but of course being very au fait with a lot of these things yourself, and also sort of Debbie, sort of both, you know, as a researcher, but also as a journal editor, sort of around this question of infrastructure. So I'm throwing that question to all of you, so feel free to have, you know, an arm wrestle or whatever to figure out who gets to go first.
Alana, do you want to go first?
Sure. So, you know, in terms of infrastructure, I don't necessarily feel that there's like a lack of infrastructure. If anything, I feel like there's a lot of options, but particularly sort of, you know, speaking from a humanities perspective, I think generally within the humanities, maybe there's not the same visibility and awareness, which, you know, Michael sort of alluded to with engineering. I think there's a sort of similar issue in the humanities in terms of just lack of knowledge and what is out there. You know, I talked about, you know, data wasn't really a word that gets used much in history, you know, particularly 10 years ago, increasingly now, but, you know, I think there's still this sort of lack of awareness of, you know, what are the infrastructure and platforms and tools out there, and that there could be sort of, you know, greater visibility, greater sort of training around that built in for, you know, particularly early career researchers, people who are up and coming, but also, you know, people who are perhaps, you know, further along in their careers as well, who, you know, might be interested in getting into, you know, what's new terrain for them. You know, I think something that's great is that, you know, there's a number of sort of, you know, open source tools and different platforms available for doing things now, and publicly, you know, funded things like Dataverse as well.
I suppose with that, like with that sort of glut of sort of the infrastructure, but there is that sort of flip side where it's just like the nature of the research is changing quite substantially. So like the type of research you're doing in history now is very, very different to, not necessarily the type of research, but the way you're doing the research is sort of shifting in terms of like, you know, what your engagement with records is like and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's another thing I think that there needs to be sort of more training around, is not just about, you know, records to data and but, you know, what do you do with the data once you have, how do you work with data, you know, is not something that is part of, you know, classical humanities training necessarily. But, you know, before I pass it over to Deborah, Michael, something I wanted to say on sort of, you know, the issues that Deborah raised with open access publishing is, you know, how important that's been as a historian in terms of community and public engagement to make those research publications publicly available. I've had a number of family descendants get in contact with me because I've written about their ancestors and you know, people who've gone through the criminal justice system, and it's, you know, often impossible to sort of track those people down, but often they come and find me once they find out the research that I'm doing. And so that's been a tremendous boon. And I think, you know, from conversations with them, that they really value that, you know, this research is being done and that it's accessible to them, that they can actually sort of, you know, find it and read about it online.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
So we've, I mean, I'm so impressed with how UTS supports us in this space. So one example is when we came from the University of Sydney a little over 3 years ago, we had electronic laboratory notebooks. We used lab archives. So all our experiments are recorded in lab archives for every person in the lab. It wasn't compulsory, but I actually made it compulsory. If you want to work in my group, this is what you do. And so UTS liaised with the University of Sydney. The University of Sydney closed off where we were at up to the point that we left them. They kept a copy of our lab archives, and then we started off again, you know, from that time, but still with access to all our old information in lab archives with UTS. I mean, I was so impressed that that was actually facilitated for my group, because it just made such a difference. So, you know, I really am very appreciative there. I think UTS is good in that it gets people thinking about data management right from the get-go. So as for new HDR students, so somebody newly studying a master's or a PhD, they have to come up, at least in science, they have to come up with a research data management plan, and that has to be written up and signed off by supervisors. And, you know, it's very, very strong, I think, in ensuring people think about their data, which is really important for, you know, the institution. There's an obligation to keep data as well. When people leave labs, which happens all the time, you know, you have an honours student, they're here for a year, a PhD student 3 or 4 years, and then they're off. You still want access to their data. It's all about, you know, being able to maintain that access. And then I think, you know, also the research integrity side of it as well, because you can see it all, you know, you can see what's there and what will leave your lab in publications. And so I think UTS does it pretty well, I think.
Oh, that's very, very positive to hear. I'm glad that that's sort of, it's having those sort of knock-on effects, especially with the younger researchers, and the fact that they have to do the RDMPs, which I can confirm is pretty, it's across the board, like everyone. If you're doing a master's or a PhD at UTS now, you have to do an RDMP. I know this because I do a lot of the training that's involved in that, so, which is fantastic to do, and I agree. I think it's great that there is that focus on that side of it.
Got a question from Mace.
Yep.
Mace, did you want to read that, or should I read it out for you? Oh, go ahead. Okay. So Mace has an interesting question about data and teaching. So do you think that open access data can be beneficial for academics in their teaching practices? And how do you think open data can be used to develop activities, assessments? And third part of the question is, what tools do we need to have access to be able to benefit from open access data in the classroom?
I don't know if I should be pointing it to specific people, but I know, Alana, we were actually chatting about this right at the beginning of the session, so I think I might let you jump in with that, because it's actually your own data that is being used in teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think open access data, you know, is terrific to see data used in teaching. I think you know, in terms of the push towards, you know, authentic assessments, work integrated learning, actually getting students to engage hands-on with actual research data is something we should absolutely be introducing into classrooms. It's something I've particularly worked on because, you know, as a sort of crowdsourcing project, you know, there's opportunities for students to, you know, have sort of hands-on engagement in an online environment with the actual transcription work of my data, and then to, you know, go off and build their own research projects about that data. So if you go to the Criminal Characters website, so I've come up with a sort of number of different lesson plans and different educational activities around using that data and working through that transcription process. And so not only use that in my own teaching, but it's actually been incorporated into a number of classrooms around Australia, both in terms of teaching criminology and teaching history.
Thank you. And it was really, really interesting to hear how that project was having these sort of dividends on so many different sort of areas and stuff. And I know from sort of personal experience, one of the first sort of classes that I sort of developed with a few people who are actually in the audience at the moment, as a WE liaison librarian, when I first started at UTS, it was basically a class showing social studies, social science students how to use openly available data around sort of commodities and being able to do stuff sort of in very basic stuff like just in Excel. But I remember one of the feedback things we got was just someone just said, I feel empowered. And they sort of went. And I thought like that's just fantastic feedback to get in that sort of situation.
Yeah.
Mace, you've got your hand up, Mace.
Just to thank you, Alana and Lena. Helen, sorry for the question and the response. Often in my domain, I work as a learning designer with Alex Lab, and often what we see is that academics find it hard sometimes to find case studies. And I was wondering if open access data would be able to offer something like that for academics. So for example, in nursing, it's very popular teaching approach that you offer case studies, and it's often not necessarily open access research, but the idea of open resources. Academics usually think maybe how reliable the data there to be used. So I was wondering if you have some examples in some of the subjects that you taught around using data to open access data to develop case studies or develop some activities like here in UTS, which will be great actually to showcase and present somehow to engage more, to encourage more engagement with open educational resources. And open data is just one thing, which I think is beneficial, but I often struggle with finding examples of actually using and building examples and put that into learning management system where students can look at, or students can themselves in an assessment actually use open access data and build some projects or some responses. So having something to show will definitely encourage academics actually to look further and see what can be done there. And yeah, so that's probably where I'm coming from, just to explain that question a little bit further.
I'm happy to jump in again, but Deborah, did you have something that you wanted to say on this?
You do more teaching than I do, Alana, but just to say, I guess we're working on a data set at the moment that is like a survey for women that have breast cancer, and I was struggling to find a biostatistician to work with, and I ended up reaching out through Franklin Women, which is an organisation for health and medical female STEM workers. And these two women down at RMIT put up their hand and said, yes, we want to do it. And part of the reason is that they know that they'll then be able to use this data set in teaching. So, you know, we've sort of made our own little open access, I guess, that way. But that data set will be put on an open access platform as well. And I would love to see it used in that way. And I agree with Mace. I think we could, certainly in science, we could be doing that a lot more, because, you know, there is access to a lot of data sets, and I think it would be stimulating for the students, because I think they would see it much more as real world and immediate as well, and what they can do with real data. I think that's powerful for the students.
Yep.
No.
So yeah, I agree, and I try and practice what I preach in terms of, you know, getting data into the classroom and teaching students different sort of skills for working with data, no matter what sort of, you know, topic we're looking at through the week. So you know, with one of the subjects I teach, Becoming Australia, it's sort of, you know, Australian history sort of survey course. And so, you know, within that sort of most weeks, you know, I try and have a sort of open data set that they're doing some sort of, you know, online activity as prep work for the week, and they might be practicing a certain type of skill using that data that's related to the topic for the week. So, it might be about doing sort of, using sort of Voyant tools and qualitative data analysis of the Prime Minister's speech transcripts, or Hansard transcripts, or different things as the case may be. So I think there's lots of sort of open data out there that can be used as case studies. Of course, it takes some sleuthing to find the right ones, and likewise, asking what sort of tools. Well, I think that's really sort of depends on the data that you're working with, but there's plenty of sort of open source tools out there that you can introduce students to, which I think is a great thing for them to open up to the possibilities of what you can do with data and understanding and analysing data.
Absolutely, I think there are. Yeah, I think as the sort of the practices become more that researchers are sharing their data, and still and teaching as well. Like I think that it kind of becomes that sort of conversation where it's like, yes, I've created this, I've shared this, I've now found this, and there's that sort of that overall familiarity of like if you're publishing your data, where to find similar data sets that you could potentially use in your teaching or something along those lines. So I think there is that sort of that growing conversation and that interplay between those two sort of dimensions of it. I would absolutely love to continue, but I'm very, very conscious of the time. We've got like 3 minutes to go. So, I mean, did any of you want to sort of say any more sort of final sort of comments about open data, what you sort of feel about it, what you feel can be done about it, or in the space, or anything, or just say we love open data? I'm okay with just like fairly emphatic statements like that before we sort of wrap up.
Yeah, well, I do. Yep, go on, Mike.
It's good to see. Alana's just posted the GLAM workbench link in the chat, that's Tim Sherritt's. Yeah, that's an excellent resource for humanities.
Open data.
Humanities data science, yeah.
Yes, yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, I love open data, and if other people love open data and want some different, humanities open data sets for teaching or research, what the case may be, check out the GLAM workbench.
And it's just got to be the way forward, because it's all about sharing knowledge and also maintaining research integrity. People might do different things with your data than you did. It's just all about pushing knowledge further and faster.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the integrity point is very, very true, and especially this idea of like, I'm getting this open data, how do I know that it's good? And obviously it depends on where you're getting it from, but one of the reasons why we try to promote open data is that it does encourage researchers to double check their data just that once a little bit more, because of the fact that someone else is going to be looking at this.
Exactly.
And yeah, all of those sorts of things. So thank you very, very much, all three of you, for coming, giving up your time to chat with us about this. It's been a fantastic discussion. Hopefully, I'm hoping everyone in the audience got something out of it and enjoyed it. As I said, it is being recorded. It's going to be shared on the YouTube channel. I don't know when exactly, but it will be shared very, very soon. Helen has just posted a bit of a feedback form in the chat. So for anyone who's sort of attended, please do give us feedback. We would love to keep doing more sessions like this and on these sorts of topics. And it would be great if we could get some sort of feedback about things other sort of sessions we can do, what you found really useful for the session, and all of those sorts of things. It's give us our own little data to work with to do more of these sorts of sessions. So again, thank you very, very much, all three of you. Really, really appreciate it, you giving up your time and for coming and sharing your stories with us.